40 Thieves of Saipan. The summer of 1944, a young Marine lieutenant led a hand-picked platoon into one of the most important and costly battles of the Pacific War. Some of his men had reputations as brawlers, rule breakers, or troublemakers. Others were hunters, ranch hands, experienced combat Marines, and unusually gifted riflemen. They were not all criminals, as later retellings sometimes claimed. Nor did they fight the Japanese army alone. They served inside a vast American campaign involving two Marine divisions, an Army division, naval gunfire, aircraft, tanks, engineers, medical units, and thousands of support personnel. Yet their work often placed them farther forward than most men around them. They moved ahead of the main line in small groups. They searched cane fields, ridges, caves, villages, and ravines for machine guns, artillery positions, troop movements, hidden routes, and ambushes. They observed what larger formations could not see and reported what commanders needed to know before sending more men forward. They became known as the 40 Thieves. Nearly 70 years later, after their commander died, his son opened the records of a wartime life his father had rarely discussed. At almost the same time, one of the surviving scouts was trying to complete a promise he had carried since Saipan, a promise connected to a Japanese soldier, a silk flag, and a family that had waited more than 7 decades for something to return home. This is the story of the 40 Thieves. It is not a story about 40 men defeating an entire army. It is a story about reconnaissance, memory, loss, and the silence many veterans carried back from the Pacific. It begins with Tarawa. In November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division attacked Batio, a small, heavily defended island in the Tarawa Atoll. The island was only a few miles long, but the Japanese had transformed it into a fortified position covered by bunkers, machine gun nests, trenches, artillery, and obstacles. The assault began with confidence. American naval guns and aircraft had struck the island before the landing. Many officers believed that the bombardment had destroyed most organized resistance. It had not. The tide was lower than expected, and many landing craft grounded on the reef. Marines had to leave their boats and cross hundreds of yards of exposed water under fire. Japanese guns that had survived the bombardment opened on the men in the lagoon. Some Marines drowned after being wounded, others were killed before reaching the seawall. The battle lasted only 76 hours, but nearly 1,000 Americans were killed and more than 2,000 wounded. Tarawa became a lesson written in blood. Bombardment alone could not reveal every hidden position. Aerial photographs could not show every bunker covered by sand, logs, and vegetation. Maps could not tell commanders which routes were passable or where the enemy had survived beneath the surface. The next operation would require better information. James P. Risley, who had served as the operations officer of the 2nd Marine Division at Tarawa, took command of the 6th Marine Regiment in December 1943. Under his authority, the regiment prepared a scout sniper platoon for future operations. The unit was not created in one dramatic moment beside the bodies on a beach. It developed from the wider experience of Tarawa and earlier fighting in the Pacific. Marine leaders understood that small groups trained in observation, fieldcraft, and precision shooting could help reduce the uncertainty facing infantry commanders. The officer chosen to lead the platoon was First Lieutenant Frank J. Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky was 29 years old. He had been born in Wisconsin to Czech-American parents and had served with the 6th Marines before the United States entered the war. He had gone with the regiment to Iceland and later experienced combat in the Pacific. He was not the kind of officer who depended entirely on manuals. The scout sniper platoon needed a leader willing to make decisions without waiting for detailed instructions. It needed someone who could control independent men without destroying the qualities that made them useful. Tchaikovsky began assembling his platoon at Camp Tarawa on the island of Hawaii, where the 2nd Marine Division was recovering and rebuilding. Later accounts often described him walking through military brigs and selecting the toughest prisoners he could find. There was some truth behind the legend. A number of the men had disciplinary records, and some had been confined for fighting, insubordination, or other violations. But the platoon was not simply a collection of criminals. Tchaikovsky looked for men with useful skills. He wanted Marines who could shoot accurately, read terrain, move quietly, remain patient, and continue thinking when isolated from their units. Some were hunters who had grown up in rural America. Others had worked on ranches or farms. Some had already fought in the Pacific and understood that battlefield conditions rarely followed a plan. One of the young Marines was Robert Gene Smots. Smots came from Oklahoma and had grown up around the Osage country. He had learned to hunt and shoot at an early age. He was physically tough, aggressive, and not always easy to control. In an ordinary rifle company, those qualities could become problems. In a small reconnaissance team, properly directed, they could be valuable. Another was Marvin Strombo, a rancher's son from Montana. Strombo understood open ground, distance, weather, and patience. He had the ability to remain still and observe before acting. There were also men such as Roscoe Mullins and August Schieber, along with others, whose names would remain largely unknown outside their families and fellow Marines. Tchaikovsky also relied on Platoon Sergeant Bill Nupple. Nupple was an experienced Marine who provided discipline and stability. A unit made up of independent men could not survive through boldness alone. Someone had to enforce standards, organize movement, and recognize when initiative had crossed into carelessness. The platoon's strength changed over time. Men were attached, transferred, hospitalized, wounded, or replaced. The nickname 40 Thieves did not always describe an exact number on a particular day. It remained the identity of the group regardless of the official roster. The men trained on the Parker Ranch lands beneath Mauna Kea. The area was cold at elevation, dry, dusty, and far different from the tropical islands where they expected to fight. Their work began with observation. They learned to study a landscape slowly. A broken branch could indicate movement. A patch of earth with a different color might hide a firing position. A shadow beneath vegetation could be the opening of a bunker. Smoke, disturbed grass, tracks, discarded food, and damaged plants could reveal the presence of men who believed themselves invisible. They practiced camouflage and movement. They learned to cross open ground without following obvious paths. They trained to use folds in the terrain and to remain still when movement would expose them. They studied Japanese weapons and uniforms. A scout who could identify a machine gun, mortar, artillery piece, or command post could report more useful information than one who simply said he had seen the enemy. They practiced map reading, range estimation, and communication. A report had to be clear. A commander receiving information from a scout needed to know what had been seen, where it was located, and how reliable the observation was. The men also trained with rifles at long distance. Not every member carried identical equipment, and the platoon did not resemble a modern sniper unit. Some used scoped rifles, while others carried standard infantry weapons. Their role included precision fire, but it extended far beyond shooting. They were expected to observe, guide, report, and survive. Their training also included close combat. Patrols moving ahead of friendly forces could encounter sentries or small enemy groups at short range. Silence sometimes mattered more than firepower. Tchaikovsky encouraged improvisation. The platoon had limited official equipment and could not assume that every request would be approved quickly. This attitude helped create its nickname. Marines had long used the word acquire when discussing supplies obtained outside normal channels. At Camp Tarawa, equipment and food sometimes disappeared from one unit and appeared near another. Stories circulated about vehicles, meat, alcohol, weapons, and other supplies finding their way into Tchaikovsky's area. Some stories grew with repetition. The truth was probably less theatrical than the legend, but the reputation remained. Other Marines began calling them the 40 Thieves. The name was not originally a formal honor. It reflected annoyance, suspicion, and grudging admiration. The platoon seemed able to obtain what it needed, even when supply officers could not explain how. For the men, the name became a source of identity. By late May 1944, the 2nd Marine Division was preparing to sail west. The target was Saipan in the northern Mariana Islands. Saipan was strategically important because its capture would bring the Japanese home islands within range of American B-29 bombers. It would threaten Japanese routes and weaken the defensive perimeter protecting the empire. The island was about 14 miles long and varied sharply in terrain. The western coast included beaches, sugarcane fields, villages, and industrial areas. The center and north contained ridges, valleys, caves, and steep ground, ideal for defense. Roughly 30,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were on the island. They had prepared artillery positions, trenches, bunkers, caves, and defensive zones. Many positions were hidden beneath vegetation or built into rock. Japanese commanders understood the importance of Saipan. Losing it would expose Japan's inner defenses and create a political crisis in Tokyo. The American invasion force was enormous, but numbers did not eliminate danger. Every ridge, cave, building, and cane field could conceal men prepared to fight until death. The Marines sailed aboard crowded transports. They cleaned weapons, checked equipment, attended briefings, and waited. On June 6, 1944, while Allied forces landed in Normandy, President Franklin Roosevelt delivered a prayer for the men fighting in Europe. Marines aboard ships in the Pacific heard his words over loudspeakers. For a moment, the two great theaters of the war seemed connected. The men heading towards Saipan knew that Normandy would dominate the headlines. They also knew that the beach awaiting them could be just as deadly to the men who had to cross it. The invasion began on June 15. Before the landing, naval guns and aircraft struck the coast. Smoke and dust rose from Japanese positions. Trees shattered. Buildings collapsed. Shells tore into fields and hillsides. But as Tarawa had already demonstrated, bombardment could not destroy everything. Amphibian tractors carried the first assault waves across the reef. Japanese artillery and mortars opened fire as the Americans approached. The beaches became crowded with damaged vehicles, wounded men, supplies, command groups, and units trying to locate their assigned sectors. The 40 Thieves came ashore with the 6th Marines. It is not possible to reconstruct every individual movement minute by minute. Later memories sometimes differed, and official records did not preserve the name of every scout involved in each patrol. What can be said with confidence is that the platoon began performing its assigned work almost immediately. Small groups moved forward to examine terrain and identify Japanese positions. They watched for movement in cane fields and among damaged buildings. They searched for weapons that had survived the bombardment. They passed information back to commanders and supporting units. The scouts did not advance completely alone. They remained connected to the larger regiment. Artillery, naval gunfire, tanks, and infantry were behind them. But when a patrol moved beyond the line, that support could feel very far away. A radio could fail, vegetation could block visibility. Enemy troops could move between the scouts and friendly forces. A patrol that became pinned down might wait hours for help, or receive none at all. The first days were violent and confused. Japanese artillery fired from caves and concealed positions. Mortars struck the beaches and assembly areas. Snipers used buildings, trees, ridges, and vegetation. Infantry units sometimes passed positions that appeared empty, only to receive fire from behind. The scouts helped reduce that danger. They located possible firing positions and marked them on maps. They observed roads and trails. They looked for signs of movement and helped guide supporting fire toward targets. Their contribution was not always dramatic. A scout might spend hours watching one patch of ground. He might return with only a few coordinates and a warning. Yet that information could prevent an entire rifle company from entering an ambush. In reconnaissance, success was often measured by what did not happen. A company did not walk into a machine gun position. A tank did not enter a mined road. A patrol did not become trapped inside a ravine. Those events rarely produced famous photographs, but they saved lives. During the early hours of June 17, the Japanese 9th Tank Regiment launched a major counterattack against the Marine beachhead. Dozens of Japanese tanks advanced with infantry through the darkness. Their objective was to break the American position before the invasion force could strengthen its hold on the island. The attack became one of the largest Japanese armored actions of the Pacific War. The battlefield turned chaotic. Tank engines, artillery, machine guns, rifle fire, and shouted orders blended in the darkness. Burning vehicles illuminated the ground and exposed men on both sides. Marine tanks, half-tracks, anti-tank guns, artillery, bazookas, and individual infantrymen engaged the attackers at close range. Accounts connected to the 40 thieves described Tchaikovsky using a bazooka against a Japanese tank during the fighting. His Silver Star recognized gallantry in action on Saipan, although some details repeated in later family stories cannot be independently verified. Popular versions sometimes claim that he single-handedly saved the entire regimental command post. That conclusion goes beyond what can be proven. What remains credible is that Tchaikovsky exposed himself to heavy fire and attacked an armored threat at close range. That required extraordinary nerve. A bazooka was not a weapon fired safely from a distant position. The operator had to approach within effective range, select an angle, expose himself, and fire while enemy infantry and vehicle weapons were nearby. The Japanese attack failed. By daylight, many of the attacking tanks had been destroyed or abandoned. Bodies and wreckage covered parts of the coastal plain. The American beachhead remained intact. Yes, the 40 thieves survived that phase of the battle, but the campaign was only beginning. American forces pushed inland through cane fields, villages, broken ground, and fortified ridges. The terrain often reduced visibility to a few yards. A scout could hear movement without seeing its source. Japanese troops used caves, trenches, stone walls, and vegetation. Some positions remained quiet until Americans passed, then opened fire from behind. The heat became exhausting. Water was limited. Dysentery, fever, infections, and dehydration weakened men who continued to fight. The scout snipers moved in small teams. They studied routes and enemy positions, but they also faced the same confusion as every infantryman on the island. The original story described the death of a Marine named Kenny in great detail. According to later recollections, Kenny moved toward what appeared to be the voice of a wounded American and was caught in a Japanese ambush. The exact words spoken that day cannot be known, nor can anyone now verify every movement or thought assigned to the men in dramatic retellings. The essential event was painful enough without invention. A young Marine believed another American might need help. He moved toward the sound and was killed. For the survivors, the death became one of the memories that remained long after the battle ended. Reconnaissance demanded suspicion. Scouts were trained to question what they saw and heard, but Marines were also taught that they did not abandon their own. The enemy understood that instinct. War could turn loyalty into a trap. The men who survived often carried questions that no official report could answer. Should someone have stopped him? Could the patrol have approached from another direction? Was the voice genuine at first? Had the enemy planned the ambush or simply taken advantage of an opportunity? Such questions had no useful answer, but that did not stop veterans from asking them for the rest of their lives. As the campaign continued, Marvin Strombo took part in patrols across the island. At some point during the fighting, he became separated from his group and found himself behind or near Japanese lines. While moving through the area, he saw the body of a Japanese soldier lying on the ground. The man appeared young. Strombo later said he saw no obvious wound and could not determine exactly how the soldier had died. The body looked peaceful, almost as if the man were sleeping. Near the soldier's chest was a folded Japanese flag. It was a Yosagaki Hinomaru, a national flag covered with handwritten names and messages. Before a Japanese serviceman left home, relatives, friends, neighbors, schoolmates, and community members sometimes wrote their names and wishes around the red sun. The flag became a personal object linking the soldier to the people waiting for him. Strombo could not read the writing. He did not know the soldier's name. He did not know where the man came from or how many family members had written on the cloth. He understood only that the flag was important. Battlefield souvenirs were common during the Pacific War. American servicemen collected flags, swords, helmets, weapons, photographs, and personal items from Japanese positions and bodies. At the time, many men did not fully consider what those objects meant to the families of the dead. Strombo later said he hesitated before taking the flag. He feared that if he left it, someone else might take it without preserving it. He decided to carry it with him and hoped that one day he could return it to the soldier's family. The dead man was Sadao Yasue from Higashi Shirakawa, a mountain village in Gifu Prefecture. Strombo did not know that yet. He still had to survive Saipan. The American advance continued north through areas later remembered by names such as Death Valley, Purple Heart Ridge, and Hell's Pocket. The names reflected the cost. Japanese defenders used caves connected by narrow passages. Artillery positions were hidden behind ridges. Machine guns covered approaches. Infantry attacks often gained only a few hundred yards before resistance stopped them. Tanks and flamethrowers became essential against fortified caves and bunkers. Engineers placed explosives near openings. Artillery and naval guns struck ridge lines, but Japanese troops often survived underground and returned to their weapons after the shelling stopped. The scouts continued moving ahead when ordered. They mapped routes, watched cave entrances, identified firing points, and reported enemy movement. Their work exhausted them. Men lost weight. Uniforms rotted from sweat, mud, and constant use. Boots broke down. Small cuts became infected. Sleep came in short periods interrupted by artillery, patrols, alarms, and insects. The men ate what they could carry. Hot meals were rare near the front. Water mattered more than food. Disease did not affect every man in exactly the same way, but fever, dysentery, dehydration, and weakness were widespread across the fighting units. No amount of training could make those conditions comfortable. The Japanese defense gradually collapsed toward the north. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito understood that organized resistance was nearing its end. Much of his command had been destroyed, supplies and communications were failing, thousands of wounded men and civilians were trapped in the shrinking Japanese-held area. Surrender remained unacceptable to much of the Japanese military leadership. Before dying, Saito approved a final general attack. Before dawn on July 7, more than 4,000 Japanese troops advanced against the American line. The main blow struck the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the Army's 105th Infantry Regiment and part of the 27th Infantry Division. The attack broke into American positions and overwhelmed sections of the line. Some Japanese soldiers carried rifles and machine guns. Others had grenades, bayonets, swords, improvised weapons, or very little equipment at all. They continued forward through heavy fire. The fighting became close and disorganized. Command posts, artillery positions, medical areas, and supply points were threatened as Japanese troops penetrated behind the front. Soldiers of the 105th Infantry suffered devastating losses. Marine artillerymen and other nearby units also fought to stop the breakthrough. The battle lasted for hours before American forces contained the attack and recovered lost ground. More than 4,000 Japanese attackers were killed. The 2 battalions of the 105th Infantry lost hundreds of men dead and hundreds more wounded. It was the largest Japanese banzai attack of the Pacific War. The 40 thieves were part of the broader American force operating on Saipan, but it is not necessary to place them at the exact center of every famous action. Their documented importance came from their repeated reconnaissance work for the 6th Marines, not from claiming every major battle as their own. On July 9, Saipan was declared secure. That declaration did not mean every Japanese soldier had surrendered or died. Small groups remained hidden, and some holdouts continued resisting for months or even years. Nor did the declaration end the suffering of civilians. Thousands of civilians had been trapped by the battle. The population included Japanese settlers, indigenous Chamorro and Carolinian people, and others who had lived on the island before the invasion. Many died from artillery, bombing, gunfire, disease, hunger, thirst, or exposure. Others were influenced by Japanese propaganda that described the Americans as brutal and inhuman. Some civilians were told that surrender would lead to torture, rape, or murder. Some were pressured or forced toward death by Japanese soldiers. Others acted from fear and despair. American forces used loudspeakers and interpreters to call civilians forward. They promised food, water, medical care, and humane treatment. Some civilians surrendered. Others refused. Near the northern cliffs, American servicemen witnessed men, women, and children jump to their deaths. Some parents carried children with them. Others pushed family members before following. No single explanation can account for every death. Propaganda, coercion, military violence, cultural pressure, panic, and hopelessness combined in different ways. For the Americans who watched, the sight was deeply disturbing. Combat had taught them to expect armed enemies. It had not prepared them to watch families choose death after refusing offers of safety. Many veterans later said that the civilians at the cliffs haunted them more than some of the combat they had experienced. The battle for Saipan cost the United States more than 3,000 dead and many thousands wounded. Almost the entire Japanese garrison was killed. only a small number of defenders became prisoners. The strategic consequences were enormous. Saipan provided bases for B-29 bombers that would later strike the Japanese home islands. The defeat also contributed to the fall of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government. But those larger consequences meant little to exhausted men standing among the dead. For them, victory meant they had survived one more island. The war was not over. On July 24, American forces invaded nearby Tinian. The landing used a carefully planned approach on narrow beaches that the Japanese considered unsuitable for a major assault. The scout snipers again supported the 6th Marines. Tinian fell more quickly than Saipan, but the fighting remained dangerous. Japanese defenders used caves, ridges, and prepared positions. Men already weakened by Saipan had to continue moving, observing, and fighting. By the end of the Marianas Campaign, the original 40 thieves no longer existed as the same close group. Some men were wounded, some became sick, others were reassigned, transferred, or promoted. Casualties and military requirements constantly changed the unit. A short article later brought limited attention to Tchaikovsky and his men, but they did not become nationally famous. There were no large public ceremonies for the platoon. Their reports became part of the wider regimental record. A cave appeared on a map. A gun position was destroyed. A safer route was selected. The official history often preserved the result, without preserving the name of the scout who had discovered it. That was the nature of their work. Successful reconnaissance frequently left little visible evidence. The unit returned information. Larger formations acted on it. When the war ended, the survivors returned to civilian life. Frank Tchaikovsky went home to Wisconsin. He continued his education, entered business, married, raised children, and later served as mayor of Sturgeon Bay. To the people around him, he became a local businessman, father, neighbor, and public official. He rarely spoke in detail about Saipan. His family knew he had served in the Marines. They knew he had received military decorations. But they did not understand the full history of the Scout Sniper platoon or the experiences other veterans associated with him. This silence was common among men of his generation. Some veterans believed civilians could not understand combat. Others feared that speaking would bring memories back with greater force. Some wanted to protect their wives and children from the things they had seen. Many had also been taught that a man should endure pain privately. Silence did not mean forgetting. A veteran could build a career, raise a family, attend church, repair a house, and participate in community life while still carrying the battlefield inside him. A sound, smell, dream, or photograph could return him to an island thousands of miles away. Families sometimes saw the consequences without knowing the cause. A father woke suddenly at night. A husband avoided fireworks. A man became silent whenever the war appeared on television. He refused to discuss a medal stored in a drawer. Children learned not to ask. Frank Tchaikovsky died in 2011 at the age of 96. After his death, his son Joseph began examining the records his father had left behind. He found names, photographs, documents, and references to the Scout Sniper platoon. The quiet father he had known had once commanded men in one of the Pacific War's most important battles. Joseph searching for survivors. Most were already dead. The war had ended more than 6 decades earlier, and the young Marines of 1944 were now elderly men. A few remained. Joseph traveled to meet them. He sat in kitchens and living rooms and listened as they described Tchaikovsky, Camp Tarawa, Saipan patrols, dead friends, and memories they had rarely shared. The interviews revealed both the power and limitations of oral history. Veterans could remember details absent from military reports. The sound of a tank engine in darkness, the taste of warm water, the face of a friend, the smell of wet vegetation, or the way a wounded man called for help. But memory, after 70 years, was not a perfect recording. Dates shifted. Separate incidents blended together. Men repeated stories heard from others. One veteran remembered an event differently from another. A responsible history had to preserve their voices without treating every remembered detail as independently verified fact. That balance mattered. The 40 thieves were real. Their missions were dangerous. Their courage did not require invented dialogue, impossible numbers, or exaggerated claims. Joseph Tchaikovsky and writer Cynthia Crack eventually published their story in the book 40 Thieves on Saipan. The book helped bring attention to a platoon that had remained largely unknown. It also gave aging veterans a chance to speak before their memories disappeared with them. For some, the interviews were painful. A recorder placed on a kitchen table could bring back a cane field, a dead friend, or a night attack. Men who had avoided the subject for decades sometimes stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. One veteran remembered weapons. Another remembered thirst. One recalled the fear of moving ahead without knowing where the Japanese were. Another remembered sepsi on the cliffs. The details varied, but one pattern remained constant. The island had never entirely released them. Marvin Strombo had carried one physical reminder home from Saipan. The silk flag remained in Montana for decades. He protected it while building a civilian life and raising a family. It was not displayed as a trophy. It remained folded and preserved. Returning, it was far more difficult than making the promise. Strombo did not speak Japanese. He could not read the names. He did not know the dead soldiers' village. Post-war records were incomplete, families moved, and communities changed. Years passed. The young Marine became a middle-aged man and then an old man. The flag waited. Eventually, Strombo learned about the Oban Society, an organization dedicated to returning Japanese wartime flags to the families of the soldiers who carried them. Researchers examined the writing. The names and messages led them to Sadao Yasue and the village of Higashi Shirakawa in Gifu Prefecture. The cloth contained approximately 180 signatures and messages. Many belonged to relatives and neighbors and members of Yasu's community. The object Strombo had protected for more than 70 years finally had a name and a destination. In August 2017, Strombo was 93 years old. He traveled from Montana to Japan. After arriving in Tokyo, he continued west into the mountains of Gifu. Higashi Shirakawa was a village of green hills, forests, fields, and narrow roads. To Strombo, parts of the landscape reminded him of Montana. The ceremony took place on August 15. The date marked the anniversary of Japan's surrender in 1945. It also fell during the season of Oban, when Japanese families honor the spirits of their ancestors. Members of the Yasue family gathered to receive the flag. Sadao's younger brother, Tatsuya Yasue, was 89 years old. His sisters were also present. They had been young when Sadao left for war. He never returned. The family had lived for decades without his body and without many of the personal objects he carried. Strombo stood before them with the folded silk. He explained through a translator that he had found Sadao on Saipan. He said the soldier had appeared peaceful and that he had seen no obvious wound. He did not claim to know exactly how Sadao died. He told them that he had protected the flag and wanted it to return to the family whose names and hopes covered it. Then he handed it over. Tatsuya held the cloth and raised it close to his face. He said that it seemed to carry the scent of his brother and of their mother's home. The family studied the writing. They recognized names of relatives, neighbors, and people who had died long ago. The flag preserved a community as it had existed before Sadao left for the Pacific. His sisters wept. The moment did not change the history of the war. It did not erase Japan's aggression, the suffering on Saipan, or the deaths of Americans, Japanese soldiers, and civilians. It did not turn enemies into friends retroactively or make the battlefield less brutal. It accomplished something smaller. It restored a personal object to the family that had created it. It allowed an American veteran to acknowledge that the enemy soldier beside whom he had once stood was also a son and brother. It gave the Yasui family a physical connection to a man they had mourned without a grave for more than 70 years. For Strombo, the return completed an obligation he had carried from his youth into old age. He could not change what happened in 1944. He could decide what to do with what remained. By returning the flag, Strombo transformed an object once taken from a battlefield into an act of responsibility. The flag had traveled from a Japanese mountain village to Saipan. It had crossed the Pacific to Montana. For 73 years, it had remained in the care of a former enemy. Now it crossed the ocean again. This time, it was going home. Marvin Strombo returned to the United States after the ceremony. He died in June 2020 at the age of 96, surrounded by generations of his family. By then, most of the men remembered as the 40s had already died. Their unit did not directly create the Green Berets, Navy SEALs, or every American Special Operations organization that came later. Those forces developed through different wartime traditions, institutions, missions, and historical experiences. It would be inaccurate to call Tarkovsky's platoon the single blueprint for American Special Forces. Yet the 40 Thieves belonged to the long development of American combat reconnaissance. Their methods included small team movement, observation beyond the main line, precision shooting, independent judgment, rapid reporting, and the identification of targets for larger forces. Those tasks would later become central to specialized Marine reconnaissance units. Their legacy should be understood without exaggeration. They were not supermen. They did not defeat 30,000 Japanese soldiers by themselves. They were not all prisoners released from military jails. They were young Marines selected for a difficult purpose. Some were disciplined professionals, some were rough, independent, and difficult. Some possessed skills learned through hunting, ranch work, or earlier combat. They trained together, fought together, and suffered losses together. Their work helped the 6th Marines move across Saipan and Tinian. Then the platoon disappeared into the larger history of the war. The men returned home and became workers, husbands, fathers, neighbors, and public servants. Most Americans never knew what they had done. Their stories remained inside footlockers, military files, family photographs, and memories that surfaced in the night. Joseph Tachovsky's search recovered part of that history, and Marvin Strombo's journey completed another part. The 40 Thieves left no grand monument on Saipan. Their success often consisted of information delivered, danger avoided, and men warned in time. They asked for little public recognition. Perhaps that was why their story remained hidden for so long. But hidden history is not the same as unimportant history. Their experience reveals how war is often fought by small groups whose names disappear beneath larger operations. It also reveals how veterans can return from battle and live entire lives without explaining what they carried home. The most enduring image of their story is not a tank exploding or a sniper firing from concealment. It is an old American Marine standing in a village in Japan. Before him are the brother and sisters of a man he encountered as an enemy in 1944. Between them is a square of silk covered with names. The war had separated those people by language, uniform, nation, and history. 73 years later, one promise brought them together. The 40 thieves had entered Saipan as scouts, riflemen, and young men trying to survive. They left carrying the dead with them, friends, strangers, civilians, and enemies. For decades, much of that burden remained unspoken. Then an old footlocker was opened. Veterans began to speak. A flag crossed the Pacific one final time, and a story almost lost to silence returned home with it.